Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Devin Chasanoff. I'm a developer advocate covering the Google Ads API, and this is a webinar on the Google Ads API. It's an intro to reporting and the Google Ads query language. As I mentioned, my name is Devin. I'm based out of New York City. And just some quick Q&A and housekeeping before we get started. If you look at the top of the screen there, you can see a link. We'd love to hear any questions that you have because we'll be holding a Q&A at the end of this webinar, and I have some of my teammates on the line. I've one of my DevRel teammates as well as one of our engineers who actually works on the API. So we'd love to hear what you're interested in, and if you see questions that other folks ask that you think are interesting, please upvote them, and that way we can cover the questions in order of popularity. So here's the agenda. This is what we'll be talking through today. Before we get started on reporting and the Google Ads query language, we'll quickly cover an introduction to the Google Ads API, just to kind of give you a foundation. After that, we'll compare and contrast the AdWords API versus the Google Ads API with respect to how they look at reporting and fetching data, because it really is a new paradigm in the Google Ads API as compared with the AdWords API. Next, we'll look at the Google Ads service, which is really going to be your entry point into making search and reporting requests, and we'll look at the different request types that you can make. After that, we'll actually break down the syntax of the Google Ads query language, and I'll show you a quick code example demonstrating how to make your first call. So in the first few sections, I'll kind of break down all of the different components of reporting, and then that code example will really pull everything together. After that, we'll look at how to actually construct query strings. And what I mean by that is, how do we know what fields we have available to us? Well, there are several different methodologies that we can use for discovering what fields we can use and how to actually construct these queries. We'll dive into that. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A with a few of my teammates, and you can see the URL at the top of the screen where we encourage you to ask questions. So without further ado, a quick introduction to the Google Ads API. If you found out about this from this webinar from either the blog or the forum, you'll see, or even in the description of this live stream, you'll see that there were a couple of prerequisites to this webinar. You know, if you didn't get to those, it's not a huge deal. I don't think you really need to understand everything about the Google Ads API in order to understand the content of this webinar. However, if there's anything that you're unsure of, feel free to go back to that and check it out. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, just really kind of give you an overview of what the API is, because it really is a completely new API that's been built from the ground up. So, as I mentioned, it has been built brand new. It's a modern API architecture. So there's no more SOAP, which was used in the AdWords API. Instead, we leverage gRPC and JSON REST protocols, which is consistent with cloud API design. And don't worry if you're not an expert on gRPC, or even if you've never heard of gRPC. If you use one of our client libraries, a lot of that will be abstracted away from you, so you can use the API without understanding what gRPC is or how to use it. The next thing I'll touch on is a unified API data model. And what we mean by this is there's really a nice bridge between fetching data and mutating data. And this comes in handy when if you want to make subsequent mutates after retrieving data, but it can also be really useful, as you'll see a little bit later, for just simply printing and displaying data to the console or in a UI. Next, I'll talk about flexible versioning. We're doing more frequent releases. That way we can get bug fixes and new features out more quickly. All of the feature releases, all of the new releases will be backwards compatible, and it's also important to note that we use semantic versioning for this. Then finally, and this is very relevant to this webinar, scalable data download, and we'll get into this quite a bit. But you can download very large results either as cache pages or stream data sets. As I touched on the previous slide, we have 6 client libraries that you can use in order to use the Google Ads API that are listed on the screen. If there is a client library that you don't see there that you would like to use, we'd love to hear from you. That feedback is really valuable, so of course let us know. But there are some benefits to using the client libraries. One of them is that I've already mentioned is that it abstracts a lot away from you, such as all of the everything that's going on under the hood with regard to gRPC, for example. It also takes care of a lot of other tasks for you, things like authentication, retry mechanisms, and other things of that nature. Now, finally, if you want to learn more about the Google Ads API more generally, we've done some workshops in the past, so feel free to follow those links there. All right, so now let's get into the actual content of this webinar. And we'll begin by talking about the AdWords API versus the Google Ads API. So I've mentioned this already, but it really is a new paradigm in terms of how we look at reporting. Of course, as you see in the first row there is a different query language. Instead of the AdWords query language, we now have the Google Ads query language, which you might hear me refer to as GACL for short throughout the webinar, just because it's a lot of words. But more importantly, the way that search and reporting is done search and reporting is performed has shifted. So in the AdWords API, you would take your AdWords query language query string, and you pass it to a query method that you would pass to a reporting interface and then download a report as a CSV or in some other format. Or alternatively, you can use one of the resource services and call a get method with a selector object. For example, you can select a few fields off of campaign and get those from the campaign service. So where this is different in the Google Ads API is that we've really combined all data retrieval. So you're not just getting data from a resource and then getting reports from a reporting interface. Any sort of data retrieval that you'll be conducting with the Google Ads API will be done with either the search or the search stream method. And as you'll see here, it is kind of similar to the AdWords API with regard to reporting, because in the AdWords API, what you would do is you'd create a selector object containing all of the different fields that you want to retrieve, and you'd retrieve them from a given structured report. It's kind of similar, but instead what we do in the Google Ads API is we use this Google Ads query language, GACL, and basically we just say select, and then we replace those dots with all of the fields that we want to get back, things like attribute fields or metrics, segments. We'll get into all of this. And then you select it instead of from a specific report, you just select it from the resource. You select it from campaign. And this kind of comes back to that concept of the unified data model that I touched on earlier. This is kind of nice because you don't have two different sides of the house where you've got, okay, I've got reporting here, but all of my mutates are, conducted in a completely different way. The objects that you work with in mutates and reporting are the same. It's the same campaign resource, and you'll see how that's beneficial a little bit later in the code example. Finally, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but if you want to learn more about migrating, we have a great section on our website. If you go over to the migration tab, select reports, you'll be able to learn a lot more about how to migrate your reporting from AdWords to Google Ads. And this has everything from field mapping to paradigm differences and a lot more detail than I've just gone into here. All right, so now let's talk about the Google Ads service and the different search request types you can make. So as I'd mentioned, the Google Ads service is really your entry point into all data retrieval, whether you're just fetching information about a specific resource or you're pulling a full report. You're going to use this Google Ads service. And there are two methods that are really important here, search and search stream. They're both very similar in that you pass a request object into each one, and as a result, you get your response containing the reporting information that you requested. Now, the difference, as you could have guessed, is that search returns page responses. Pages are cached and can be accessed via a next page token. So the best use cases for search are if you have a smaller result set, and that's relatively speaking, the default page size is 10,000 rows or 10,000 items. If you think that your report or your search result will be 10,000 rows or less, you can use that search method. Another good use case is if you have a UI that's presenting reporting results to end users, and it's a page-by-page UI, this might be a good use case where you can take advantage of the pages being cached, use that next page token, and then the results will be streamed a little bit more quickly to your end clients. One of the downsides, search can be slower than search stream, and it can time out with large result sets. So on the flip side, we have search stream, which of course gives you streamed responses. And this is best for large results, basically anything over that one-page limit. However, the downside of search stream, and this is kind of built into streaming in general, if your stream is interrupted for any sort of reason, like a network issue, for example, you'll need to restart the stream. There's no way to pick up from where you left off. Now, finally, I'm going to touch on using the get method on a specific service. Now, you might be scratching your head because earlier I said, well, AdWords API used the get method on a service, but Google Ads API does not. Well, Google Ads API has this functionality. For example, you can call get on the campaign service. However, we really only recommend using this for educational and debugging purposes. And part of the reason for that, one of the reasons you might not want to use it for anything other than those purposes are that there are strict limits. Only about 1,000 requests per day are allowed. However, it can be useful if you are trying to learn more about a given field, because when you use the get method, all of the fields of the object are returned. And this is different than if you were creating a GACL string and using search or search stream, because when you create that string, you select which fields you want to get back, and only those fields will be returned. If you're using the get method, every single field on that resource will be returned, which can be useful if you're trying to learn more about that given campaign or debug or whatever it is. But of course, it is computationally expensive and slower. So just can't emphasize this enough. Don't use get in production for reporting or retrieval purposes. All right, so now that we know a little bit about the methods that we would use in order to make a search or search stream request, let's talk about the query string that we would pass into those methods. We'll begin by talking about query structure and grammar. So if we just kind of run through that left-hand column, you'll get a pretty good idea of what this syntax looks like. You select fields from a resource where certain filtering conditions apply. You can order your results, limit your results, and there's also this parameters clause. I'm not going to get into that today. You can check it out on the documentation website, but it's not that often used. But just to kind of touch on this a little bit further, as I mentioned earlier, that select field, if you think about a report as a table, the select field are the columns in the table. These are the fields that you'll get back, and only the fields that you request will be returned. From, that's the resource that you're selecting from, and you'll notice that both select and from are required. None of the other clauses are required. you need to specify which columns you want to get information about, which columns you want returned, and of course, which resource that you're actually getting those fields from. Filtering conditions, ordering and limiting, that's all optional. So you might say that this looks a little bit like other query languages that you've used in the past, perhaps SQL. While it is, somewhat similar, it's not SQL. So just be cautious of that, because many of the operators that you might be used to don't apply here. For example, there's no select star operator in Gackel. In addition, there are no joins. However, we have this kind of built into the language itself with something called attributed resources. We'll touch on this on the next slide. And there's no group by. We actually build this in using something called segments. Again, we'll get into a lot of detail on segments soon. So I think the easiest way to do this, to really understand Gackel and how it works, is really just dissect an interesting query. And before we do, I just want to kind of point out the color coding on the slide, just so it's not confusing. I don't want you thinking about the color coding. I want you thinking about how this query language actually works. So just to kind of explain why things are color coded, and so this makes more sense to you. The resource in our from clause will be in blue, regardless of which clause it's in. You can see it's blue in select as well as where. All of our metrics are in green. The attributed resources, which are those implicit joins I mentioned, are in red. So both campaign as well as bidding strategy are attributed resources on ad group. And then finally, segments are in orange. So let's start by talking about the from clause. So this is pretty self-explanatory, I hope, but this is basically the resource you are selecting from. This is the resource that we are getting data from, and every resource has a set number of fields that you can retrieve when that field is in the from clause. And that brings us to select. So let's talk about select. So with select, you can select a number of different types of fields. Again, these are the columns that will be in your reporting result. Now, if we look at this here, we can select the fields on the resource in our from clause. So for example, every ad group has an ID and a name. You can put those directly into your select clause, and you'll get those in your result. Similarly, you can request metrics. Now, keep in mind that not all metrics are available to every single resource. Every resource has a defined set of metrics as well as segments that are available to select when that resource is in the from clause. So in this example, both metrics.impressions and metrics.clicks are available to select when ad group is in the from clause. So when we include these here, we will get all of that metric data in our result set. Next, we have attributed resources, and this is what I've referred to as implicit join. So we don't have joins in Gackel, but instead we have this attributed resources feature. So if you think about it, every ad group has a campaign because every ad group is associated with a campaign. And every ad group is associated with one campaign. Each campaign can have many ad groups, but each ad group can only have one campaign. Similarly, every ad group can only have one customer, one bidding strategy. And as a result, when you have those types of relationships, you get the ability to actually pull in data from those attributed resources directly into your select clause. So when you and you can look up which attributed resources are available on a given resource, but if you have an attributed resource, what you can do is take any of the fields on those attributed resources, put them directly into your select clause, and those will be columns in your reporting output. Now finally, we can put segments into our select clause. And here we have segments.device as well as segments.week. And this actually has two different outcomes, placing segments into our select clause. One, and you've probably figured this out by now, but when we do this, we get columns for each of those different segments in our reporting result. But the other thing that happens when we put segments into our select clause is this is like an implicit group by. So if we put segments here, all of our results will be grouped by device as well as week. Now let's talk about filtering results. So we filter results with the where clause. And the first thing you might notice is that you can chain different filtering conditions together by using the keyword and. And you can place different types of fields into your filtering conditions. So for example, we can filter on date. So we see where segments.date during last 30 days. That during is it's a nice convenient keyword. There are a few different options when you use during. For example, last 30 days, last 7 days, I think yesterday and today are some options. And then we can also filter on the fields that are available on the attribute in our from clause. So for example, status is an attribute on ad group. So we can get the status of all ad groups, or we can filter our result set to only include ad groups that are either enabled or paused. And this is an opportunity to bring up another little syntax here. If we want to select multiple different options, we can use that in keyword with parentheses, and that'll select both of the options or everything inside of the parentheses. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have attributed resource fields, so we can actually put those directly into our where condition as well and filter where bidding strategy.status equals enabled. So, and this is another piece of syntax, you can just simply write equals and put the status there. So when we filter this, when we combine all of these together with the and clauses, or with the and keywords, we're filtering results to just the last 30 days to ad groups that are either enabled or paused, but only bidding strategies that are enabled. Next, we can order our result set. We can do so by segments, attribute fields, attributed resource fields, or metrics. There are some details in terms of what you can put in there and when, but we're not going to get into that detail, that nitty-gritty detail today. That might be a conversation for another future webinar. And then finally, we have limit. You can put an integer there and limit the number of rows in your result set. And with that, you've kind of walked through the entire grammar and syntax of a query, a GACL query string. So let's talk a little bit more about segmenting. So I've gone over this briefly, but there is some complexity to it. So I just want to make sure that you all understand what's going on with segmenting. So the first thing to keep in mind is that there is some sort of implicit segmentation going on. Every report is segmented by the resource in the from clause. And by that, I mean, by the resource, I mean by the specific ID of that resource, or in our case, the unique identifier in the AdWords API is the resource name. So it will be segmented by that resource name. Otherwise, if we selected campaign.name, status, and impressions without filtering, we would get one row that wouldn't be very useful. Instead, we get one row for every campaign that's in our account. And as you can see here, we have the resource name, which is returned by default. You don't actually have to request that in your select clause. You get the campaign.name, status, and our metrics as rows. Pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about what happens when you put segments into your select clause. So now we've inserted segments.device into our select clause. And what happens here, a segmented query returns a row for every combination of the main resource being queried, so the resource name, as well as the segment values. So let's assume there are only two campaigns in our account, one with the ID 1 through 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and one counting from 9 through 0 backwards, right? So we have those two campaigns. They're the same color coding as we had on the previous slide. However, you'll see that each one is further segmented by the devices which people use to view your ads. And for the sake of simplicity, we're assuming that people only looked at your ads on either mobile or desktop. So instead of getting 2 rows, we now get 4 rows. And just to kind of illustrate this a little bit further, this is the first campaign, counting from 1 through 90, where we have just 1 row that's returned because we only have 1 campaign on our account, and you can see all the different columns there. But when we add segments.device, we get this additional column, segments.device, and this also breaks out that first row into 2 separate rows here, one for each segment, one for each device that people use to view your ads. And here's the kind of side-by-side view of those, or top and bottom. All right, so next let's talk about segmenting resources. So you've seen a few different types of segments, things like date, device. Certain resources also allow you to segment on other resources. And in order to find out if a resource has segmenting resources, you can look at the documentation, and these are typically available in reporting views. And I haven't really spoken about reporting views yet, so this is probably a good opportunity to do so. A reporting view is really just a resource that aggregates common fields, segments, and metrics for common reporting purposes. Because there's no click resource, we have this click view resource in order to generate a report about clicks. So with that, the click view, as you can see there, has 2 segmenting resources, ad group and campaign. So if we were to place those into our select clause, our result set would be segmented by whichever one of those segmenting resources we placed in our select clause. And as you can see at the bottom of the illustration, the bottom red square, in addition to having those segmenting resources, ClickView also has kind of ordinary segments that you can group by. Now, these aren't just available on views. For example, if you look at campaign budget, you can segment based on the campaign resource. All right, so now that we've kind of taken a look at the kind of how reporting works within the Google Ads API. We've taken a look at how the grammar and syntax of the Google Ads query language kind of works. Let's take a full look, beginning to end, how we might construct or how we might code up an example to get keyword stats for an account. So I do so using the Java client library. Don't worry if you don't know Java. The principles apply across libraries. There will be slight differences from client library to client library. This one happens to use the client library for Java, but hopefully this really ties all of these concepts together for you so you can understand how all this fits together. In this code example, we'll show you how to retrieve keyword stats using SearchStream so that we can discover how our various keywords are performing. The basic steps entailed are creating the Google Ads Service Client, creating the search query, constructing and sending the request, iterating through our results, and printing the result set to the console. Let's get started. First, we'll create a Google Ads Service Client from a Google Ads Client instance. We typically do this inside of a try block in Java so that the gRPC connection is automatically closed once our request is complete. In general, you should reuse these connections whenever possible. Next, we'll create our query string using the Google Ads query language. Because we're looking at keyword stats, we'll use one of the built-in views, Keyword View. Let's take a look at the keyword view in the reporting reference docs to see what fields we have available to us in our query. At the top, you can see the resources that this view has access to, similar to an implicit join. This means that we can use any of the fields on the resources listed here in our search query. For example, if we check out the Ad Group Criterion documentation, you can see the fields adgroupcriterion.keywordMatchType and adgroupcriterion.keyword.text are available on the Ad Group Criterion resource. which means we can include them in our GACL query when the keyword view is the main resource. Let's add a few of the fields from those attributed resources to our select clause. We'd like to know what campaign and ad group a given keyword is associated with, so we'll add their IDs and names to the select clause. In addition, it would be useful to know more information about the keywords themselves, and the information for which is available on Ad Group Criterion. Let's add the Ad Group Criterion's criterion ID, keyword text, and keyword match type to our select clause. Looking back at the keyword view documentation, we can see what segments and metrics are available when keyword view is the main resource in the from clause. Let's add impressions, clicks, and cost micros to our select clause so that we know how our keywords are performing. We'll add keyword view to our from clause because that is the resource we'll be retrieving data from. Next, let's add some filtering conditions. Let's only look at this data for the last 7 days, which we can view by using the shorthand segments.date during last 7 days. Let's further refine our search by chaining filtering conditions together with the AND keyword. Let's limit our results to search campaigns and active campaigns. Let's include ad group criteria that are either active or paused. We can add multiple conditions to a filtering condition with this in notation. Finally, let's order the results set by impressions in a descending order with the limit the number of results to 50. Next, we'll create our request. Because we want to issue a search stream request, we'll create a search Google Ads stream request using the builder notation, which is common in Java, and populate it with our customer ID and search query. Note the customer ID needs to be converted to a string because the customer ID field on search Google Ads stream request requires a string. We can now issue our search request by calling searchstream_callable.call on the Google Ads service client we created earlier. The response, which we'll name stream, is a server stream object of type search Google Ads stream response. Finally, let's iterate through and print our result set. We can get access to the result list by iterating through the responses in the stream, and then iterating through the Google Ads rows in the results list of the response. Each Google Ads row represents a single row returned from our search request. One of the advantages of the Google Ads API is that you get access to first-class objects in your response, which makes parsing the response or even making subsequent mutate requests very easy. As you can see here, we can pull campaign, ad group criterion, and metrics objects directly off of each Google Ads row object. Keep in mind that each of those objects will only be populated with the fields we specified in our select clause. Let's print some information about the results to our console. I'm going to paste in the string we'll print to the console to save some time. We'll print our keyword text and match type, ad group and campaign IDs and names, and the associated metrics with each. As we specify the variables to replace our placeholders below, you can see how useful it is to have direct access to the objects in our Google Ads row. We can get the keyword text and match type directly off of the ad group criterion object. Similarly, we can get the IDs and names of the campaigns and ad groups directly from the campaign and ad group objects. And we also get the metrics from the metrics object. Now, let's run our example. As you can see, our example runs as expected, printing all of the results to our console. So now let's talk about constructing GACL query strings. So you've seen me put different fields, different segments, metrics into these different query strings, but how do I know what fields I have available to me, right? How do I know what to select? It's the possibilities seem endless. Well, it's actually not too difficult. You've seen one example several times already, including in that code example. And the easiest way to do this, in my opinion, is using the reporting reference documentation. So this is a screenshot that you've seen before. And this is for ClickView. And if you go into the Reports tab and then click on a resource, you can see all the attributed resources, the segmenting resources, as well as resource fields, segments, and metrics. And that's how you know what you have available to you for a given resource. Next, we have something called the Google Ads Field Service. And this can be really useful for fetching field metadata. And some use cases for using the Google Ads Field Service. One, of course, learning more about a given field, what fields are available on a resource. If you're building a testing and debugging tool, that can be really useful. If you're building a query builder on top of the Google Ads API, that could be a good use case for the Google Ads Field Service. And in fact, the reporting reference documentation that you've seen already, as well as something called the Interactive Query Builder that I'll show you a little bit later, are both built using the Google Ads Field Service. So we actually use this ourselves. So the Google Ads Field Service, as you can see a screenshot of the service on the right. It has several methods, but the one that we care about is search Google Ads fields. We'll pass in a request and we'll get a response object. Just to kind of show you visually, this is similar to how searching works, but we have our search Google Ads field request, which contains a query string. Pass that query string to the search Google Ads fields method on the Google Ads Field Service. And as a result, we'll get a search Google Ads field response. And one of the fields in that response will be an array of results containing Google Ads field objects. Now, a Google Ads field object is an object containing different metadata about the fields. You can see some of the fields here, such as the resource name, the name, category, whether it's selectable, filterable, sortable, and so forth. So I think the easiest way to really understand the Google Ads Field Service is just to take a look at an example. So this is an actual query that you can put together, and what this does is it actually retrieves all of the field metadata for the entire Google Ads API. This is on the left in our select clause. You see every field listed there is every field that you can select using the Google Ads Field Service, from name all the way down to is repeated. So that's our GACL string. And on the right, we have our JSON response, and you can see the ... notation on the top and bottom. This is one item in the results array that we get, because we would get a similar item like this for every single field in the Google Ads API, but this is just one of them. And as you can see, first off, I'll point out that resource name, you can see it's not in our select clause. It's actually not allowed in the select clause, and it's automatically returned in the response. But you can see on the right, all of the different data points that we asked for are there. We can see the category of account budget is a resource. It is a data type of message. We can see that it is not selectable, filterable, or sortable. And this is, just keep in mind, on the resource level. Some of the fields on account budget might be selectable, filterable, or sortable. You can see the fields that it's selectable with. And this is something that I haven't touched on yet. As it turns out, not all fields are selectable with other fields. This comes into play a lot with segments and metrics. But if you put certain fields into your select clause, other fields then become unselectable in your select clause. So they don't work together. So we also have the attributed resources, which we've talked about before, type URL, and whether it's a repeated field. So let's talk about, there are slight differences between the Google Ads Field Service query language and the Google Ads service. So for example, the first thing that you'll notice, from is required with the Google Ads service. When you're using the Google Ads Field Service, there is no from clause. You're not selecting from any given resource. You're just getting data from the API. However, you didn't see this on the previous example. We can filter our results using where. And one of the common things that we would filter on might be name, for example. So in the example we saw on the previous page, the name was account budget. But a name can be a resource like account budget or ad group. It can be a resources field like campaign ID. It could also be a segment or a metric. So in this example, we're just going to get information about the ad group resource. And we do so by saying select name, categories, selectable, filterable, sortable, and we filter by saying where name equals ad group. Now instead of getting a full results array of every single field available in the Google Ads API, our results array will only include this one field because there is only one resource with the name of ad group. And as I mentioned, we use the Google Ads field service in order to generate the reporting reference docs. Here's just one kind of random field from the reference docs just to kind of show you that this information is also available there, and this is what it looks like in those docs. All right, so another thing I mentioned earlier, we have a tool called the Interactive Query Builder in order to construct YACL strings. So this is a UI-based tool. And what you can do is explore the query syntax directly in your browser. What's cool about it is that it dynamically populates all of the fields that are available to you based on your selections. So the first thing you do is select a resource. And then what you would do is select what fields would go in your select clause. Now that is populated dynamically to only include the fields that are available when ad group is the resource in your from clause. Similarly, you'd select your filtering conditions and your order by, and all of those are dynamically populated and updated based on your selections. And when you're done, you can just copy your query string, put it in your code example or your application, and then you can run it. And the URL I should mention is at the bottom left. If you do want to check this out, I would definitely recommend it. It's really cool. One of my teammates built it. I use it all the time. All right, and then finally, we have the protocol buffers or what we refer to as protos, is a good way to learn more about what fields are available to you. And if you're not familiar with protocol buffers, not a big deal. You don't have to learn about this in order to use the API. But protocol buffers are an interface definition language. Basically, it's the way that we actually define the API. So this is the definition of all of our services, resources, fields, and so forth. This is actually what is used to generate the API. It's used to generate all the reporting all the reference documentation, everything like that. Most of the information that's available in the protos, or a lot of the information that's in the protos, is available in the reference docs. However, there is some additional information here. I'm not going to dive into the protos here. Just wanted you to know that they're out there. They're publicly available on GitHub. So if you do want to dive in, if you're curious, if it's helpful, you're more than welcome to check those out. All right, so now let's just talk about some key takeaways and resources. So key takeaways, I think the first thing that I want to point out is that the Google Ads query language and searching and reporting in general with the Google Ads API, we tried to make it simple, powerful, and flexible. You're not kind of tied into specific reports. There's definitely a unification between your searching and your mutating. So that's what we're really aiming for. We hope you think it's. We hope you also think it's simple, powerful, and flexible. And to that end, the AdWords API and the Google Ads API utilize different reporting paradigms. If you are migrating, or rather, if you are using the AdWords API and are going to migrate to the Google Ads API, we will recommend that you kind of rebuild this from the ground up. This isn't just a kind of syntax shift. It's really a new paradigm. So you're best off not building a shim or translation layer or something like that. Next, we talked about the Google Ad Service, the different methods that you can use to search, and we also talked about GET, which can be used for testing and debugging. We covered GACL, query structure, and grammar, and then we looked at different ways to fetch field metadata in order to actually construct our GACL queries. Now, finally, I'll leave you with some resources. As you can see here on the left, more information about reporting. There's some guides there about reporting, about the Google Ads query language. the reporting reference docs, which we've looked at several times today, the protocol buffers, which I just mentioned, and then finally we have a ton of code examples in our client libraries, which you can take a look at in order to see how we construct all of these search and search stream requests. And for example, that get keyword stats example that we went through earlier, that is available in all of our client libraries. On the top right, we have some developer tools. There's the link to the interactive Google Ads Query Builder again. We also have a tool called the AdWords and Google Ads API Web Navi. This is a Chrome extension where if you're using or if you're in the UI of Google Ads, it'll just give you pointers to links to pages in the reference documentation related to the fields that you're looking at on that given page. And finally, getting support on the bottom right. We have our blog. Feel free to subscribe to that for important updates. We definitely recommend that. The forum is a great way to learn more, ask questions, learn from the community. And then, of course, we have dedicated support. There's an email alias that you can use, Google Ads API-support@google.com. Now, before we go, we are interested. This is the first of many webinars that are coming up in the next few quarters or years. And as you can see from the title of this webinar, this is really an introductory sort of webinar. It's intro to Google Ads query language and reporting, or reporting in Google Ads query language. So I've really only scratched the surface of a lot of kind of detailed complexities and nuances of GACL and searching. Some other things that we might cover in future webinars are language rules, for example, field compatibility. I touched on this very slightly. There are some kind of nuances and quirks when working with dates that you need to know about. So we could get into that, labels, and a few other things. But we'd love to learn what you want to hear about. What you want to learn about. So please let us know. You can either let us know by posting in the Ask a Question link at the top of the slide, or there is a feedback link at the top of every page of the documentation where you can submit that feedback. So we'd love to hear from you. All right, with that, thank you for listening to this webinar. We hope that you learned a lot and really have a newfound understanding for how searching and reporting and also GACL works with the Google Ads API. But I'm sure you all have some questions. So now I'll invite some of my teammates to join me and we'll open up to a Q&A. Thanks so much. All right, so hope you all enjoyed the webinar portion. I think we've gotten some great questions here. It looks like one of my teammates, David, has been active and answering some of the questions throughout the presentation portion, but we can run through some of his answers and cover any others that he hasn't covered yet. So with that, I will start going through the questions here. So at the top, hi Mattia, we miss you. But Bree has a question about the migration period in terms of when you'll need to migrate from AdWords to the Google Ads API. David's answered this very well, but I just wanted to point it out because it's an important question. We haven't announced a sunset date for the AdWords API, but once we announce that, you'll have at least a year in order to migrate. Just check if there are any new ones. Matthias here has a question about retrieving auction insight data. And David's offered an answer here, and maybe one of my teammates can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think you can get some of that data using the keyword view, one of those views that I'd spoken about earlier. I know some impression share data is available, so if that's the type of data you're looking for, you can get it from that keyword view, but not every single piece of data related to auction insights is available. For example, I know some competitor domain information isn't available. I guess, is there anything, Corey or Elliot, you want to add? And actually, this is before you jump in, I should probably introduce my teammates who are on the line. I have Corey Lucino, who's another developer advocate on my team covering the Google Ads API, and also Elliot Yan, who is one of our engineers. Is there anything either of you would add to that question? Okay, great. So with that, we can keep going through the questions. So just a question regarding error handling, and I think David answered this quite well. Just in terms of getting more specific error messages, you can enable, I'll just find David's answer down here, but you can enable more detailed logging, and he's provided an example of how to do this in Python, and it's fairly similar across different languages. Of course, the logging setup will be different in each individual language, but each client library has directions for enabling logging. Okay. So here is a question from Jesus. V5 of Google Ads API contains all the functionalities of the Google AdWords API. A long time ago, we had to return Google AdWords API because could not find mutate link accounts and get customer info. So David's answered this one as well. So almost all of the features are there, which you can read his response. And this actually kind of comes back to the point about sunsetting the AdWords API, and the fact that once we hit that parity level and all of the features are present, that's around when we'll announce the sunset clock, and it'll be at least a year, but that sunset won't occur until after. And I should also add, if Corey or Elliot, if you have anything to add, please feel free to chime in here throughout any of the questions. Thanks, Corey. So a new question we have here from Carlos is about the size of the Java client library. So this is a great point, that it supports all the versions from V2 through V5. So right now, I don't believe we have any plans to reduce those numbers in order to avoid breaking folks. One of the things that I'd mentioned earlier in the webinar is that the API is backwards compatible. And part of the reason why we support multiple versions is you don't have to migrate all of your features at the same time. So for example, let's say we do a new release to V5 or V6 or whatever it is, you can migrate some of your features to that latest version, but keep some other features tied to an earlier version of the API. That's designed to kind of reduce the workload on all of you, and that way you're not you don't have to kind of migrate your entire application if it's somewhat large at the same time, because we can understand that can be somewhat burdensome. With that said, we do try to do this. We do sunset versions. As you can see, V1 isn't supported in V5. But to that end, I think this is great feedback, Carla. So thank you for asking this question. And this is something that we will cover, that we'll discuss as a team. Okay, and I just want to make sure that you all can hear Corey and Elliot here. Oh, sorry. If you just heard a sound test that I was running. Let me open up to see if there are any other questions. Yeah, so Matthias, the auction data related to competitor domains, it's not all available in the API. And let me just, I don't think you all can hear David and Corey. Corey, you want to just try speaking again? I just want to make sure folks can actually hear you. Okay, and while we figure that out, I'll look to see if there are any other questions, but what Corey was saying earlier was that we definitely encourage you all to check out the webinar, the forum that we have to ask any sorts of questions. We also have the support alias that I'd referenced on the resources slide. Okay, so with that, I don't think there are any more questions, and we're almost at the 11 o'clock mark there. Oh, wait, just one more question before we go. What about YouTube integration? Is it better integrated in the Ads API than current AdWords APIs? So I'm going to ask Elliot and Corey if perhaps you have some insight, and I can just relay what they say, because I'm not sure about this one. Okay, yeah, so Corey has just told me that new features will be coming out in the Google Ads API, but there won't be any new features released in the AdWords API. So please keep an eye on our blogs and on the developer site, and we'll provide updates there as we have them. Johan here has a question. Where can I find the presentation or the resource links? We'll be posting the presentation, a link to the presentation in the YouTube description after the webinar has concluded. All right, any final questions from folks before we go? Great, and I just see some feedback from Carlos. Yeah, that is a good point. Some serverless technologies have limits. This is great feedback, Carlos. Thank you for providing this. This is something that I help work on the client library for Java. So I'll definitely bring this feedback to the team and see what we can do to kind of mitigate this this burden for you. Okay. That I don't think there are any further questions. So thank you everybody so much for attending, for listening, for the questions. We hope that you all learned a lot of, about reporting and GACL, and if you have future questions, please visit the forum or the support alias. Thanks so much, everyone.